Rarely does anyone take the time to explain clearly the major foreign affairs issues and why you should care. Senator Chris Coons of Delaware serves on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and is widely known as a thought leader on Capitol Hill on foreign policy. He joins us to clearly explain the situations involving China, NATO, Ukraine, Canada, Greenland, Panama, and why every American should care about cuts to foreign aid. Let's swear into the People's Cabinet, Senator Chris Coons. Senator Chris Coons, welcome to the People's Cabinet.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be on with you.
Senator, you are well known for being an expert in foreign affairs, and you've been all around the world. So many Americans, I think, don't know enough about foreign affairs. They don't actually know why they should care. In fact, some studies and some polls have shown that less than half, or just about half, of people think that we should even play a role in world affairs. So let me just start with a basic question to you. How do you make the case to people that they should care, in particular about foreign aid?
Well, three different foundational questions. What keeps Americans safe? What helps keep us prosperous? What reflects our values? What keeps us safe? I'm the only member of Congress who went to Liberia during the Ebola pandemic. There was a huge freak out in the United States, understandably, about the terrifying hemorrhagic fever Ebola. I think this was in 2014. It predicted in some ways what much later happened with the COVID pandemic. Because the world is fully integrated, people fly all over the world every day, it is impossible to wall off the United States from the potentially negative impacts of terrorist attacks, of disinformation, of negative social media influences, of the consequences of negative international events, whether it's pandemics, trade, information, or technology. So the idea that we could just pull up the drawbridge and keep the United States safe without engaging with the world is a century out of date. What keeps us prosperous? After the Second World War, we were the overwhelmingly dominant manufacturing power on the planet, and we set about building a global system of rules and alliances, partnerships, and trade that more than not made us safer, stronger, healthier, more secure. The average income of our poorest state is higher than the average income of most of our European allies. So your average person in Mississippi makes more per year than your average person in most European countries. And the current rhetoric is that, we're a sucker nation and we've been taken advantage by the world. There are some instances you can point to where trade did not work to our benefit. But overall, over the last 80 years, we have grown faster. Our economy's diversified more. We've had more education, more health, more opportunity for our country and our people because of trade. My little state of Delaware, it's just 1 million people, but we grow a lot of chicken. We export a significant percentage of that chicken. Most farmers, ranchers in our country know that they're only profitable, they're only prosperous because of how much we export of what we grow here. There's a lot of other businesses where that's true, but that's just one example. And then last, what it says about our values. For my faith, I'm Christian, this is the Lenten period, where we're reflecting on what is the obligation we have towards our neighbor and who is my neighbor. To pretend that the United States is an isolated island, indifferent to the condition or the suffering of millions around the world, who we could feed or who we could help develop or who we could help become secure democracies with vibrant societies, is to turn a blind eye to the human condition. Many of us have families that came here as immigrants from other countries, fleeing violence or persecution, seeking religious liberty or opportunity. And so I would argue that we are interconnected with the rest of the world by virtue of our immigrant heritage and founding, by virtue of our values that see others, not just in our neighborhood, not just those who look like us or sound like us, but around the world as neighbors. So why should we be involved in the world? It helps keep us safe, it helps make us prosperous, and it helps show us, our children, and the world what our values are.
Why do you think there is a disconnect, though? Because what you're saying is very compelling, But it seems like President Trump has capitalized almost on this lack of connection between the things that you're describing and how important it is and the everyday American.
Well, first, Donald Trump did not win by a decisive margin. He spends a lot of time talking about his mandate. He won by a very thin number. He did win all 7 of the key swing states, but he won by less than 1%. And this was not the sort of overwhelming mandate that a Ronald Reagan had, for example, where he won 49 states. This is a very closely divided country. It's been a 50-50 country since the 2000 election, which was decided by a few hundred votes. First. Second, there's long been a misperception in Middle America about how much we spend on foreign aid. It was less than 1% of our budget last year. So out of a $1.7 trillion discretionary budget, we spent in total about $30 billion on USAID last year, which was the principal foreign aid agency before it was shut down. And there's lots of other things we do that you could describe as foreign aid, but they're really more diplomacy or military. So first, your average American thinks we spend 25% of the federal budget on aid, and when they find out it's less than 1%, they're often surprised. Second, Trump has misperceived or misled the American people around how much fraud, waste, and abuse there was in foreign aid. In any multi-billion-dollar undertaking of the federal government, whether it's the Department of Defense or the Department of Agriculture, you can find a dozen examples of $1 million here or $10 million there that were misspent. But foreign aid was one of the most aggressively audited and closely monitored programs because there were concerns about waste, fraud, and abuse. Last, I think this goes to the core of the values that President Trump is championing, values that are less compassionate, more cruel, less about partnership and collaboration, and more transactional. And so if you've got a president who seems to champion a tough, transactional, what's in it for us worldview, and foreign aid has often been explained or justified on the basis that this is about helping other people, then you're in an environment where it's easier to slash foreign aid. There are plenty of Republicans in the House and Senate who have supported key foreign aid programs. It was President George W. Bush who launched PEPFAR, which was the campaign to fight HIV/AIDS, and has saved more than 27 million lives over the last 25 years. But there are folks of both parties who do think we shouldn't be doing it. So I think he's capitalized on a moment in the United States where folks are both consuming a lot of disinformation, inclined to believe wrong numbers, eager to say, why should we do that when we've got problems here at home? And where the argument wasn't made as effectively as it needed to be, that this isn't just about charity. Most of the money spent by USAID was actually spent on American services or products that were then deployed overseas.
And I'm sure you're hearing all kinds of stories of what the impacts of the cuts have been. Is there one in particular that stands out to you that really gets to you?
There's lots, and it'd be hard to pick. They're one of the very first that made it into the national press was about a refugee who was in a medical clinic who was cut off from oxygen therapy and told, sorry, but you're going to die. And I've been to a lot of the countries where the World Food Program, Save the Children, CARE, World Vision operate. Most of the humanitarian programs of our foreign aid assistance were not carried out by USAID staff. They're carried out by nonprofit partners like Catholic Relief Services or World Vision. And they've shut down programs all over the world. I was in a refugee camp last August where World Food Program, which is a UN entity, it's run by Cindy McCain, Senator McCain's widow and a close friend. And they had just been told that the rations for most families were going to be cut. Now they've been reduced probably to zero because of the massive cuts that have been made. It's really hard to look mothers in the eye who are only getting a few cups of rice and beans a week with a little bit of salt and oil to cook it in, that we're just done. We're not going to help at all anymore.
I want to touch on a few different aspects of foreign policy, because I think a lot of our listeners hear a lot about the different things happening in the world, but may not know enough about them and want to understand more. So let's start with China, because obviously that's top of mind. It's in the news a lot. And I know that we could spend the entire time talking about tariffs, but just in general, I think most people know that China's very big, economy is very big. They're a threat to the United States, but maybe not know the next levels beneath that. So could you talk a little bit about how you perceive China, how listeners should be thinking about it, and where you think it may be going in the coming years?
China is a very large, very complicated society with an ancient history and is very rapidly modernizing. On the positive side, they've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the last decades. They are contributing remarkable discoveries and inventions in every major field of technology. And they have a deep and ancient culture. On the very negative side, in my view, a lot of that modernization was done at our expense by stealing American inventions and intellectual property. They are competing with us directly in terms of the values that will guide the world and world systems. I've been to dozens of countries where when I first visited 15 or 20 or 25 years ago, the Chinese presence was very minimal, and the United States was the partner of choice, either commercially or politically or for development purposes, and where the Chinese have largely supplanted the United States. So Nairobi, for example, is a city I first went to in 1984, and I've been to a dozen times, I think, since. You can't drive around Nairobi without seeing big signs of Chinese development projects, without seeing a demonstrable Chinese economic presence. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying that the United States, which had enjoyed for decades being the predominant global partner, whether it was for Turkey or Indonesia, Brazil or Kenya, now faces very active peer competition from China for economic partnerships, for hearts and minds, and for security relationships. And so for those of us who care about democracy, free speech, open society, free media, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and their approach to governance and to individual rights is fundamentally different from ours. And they are actively telling societies and leaders through their information channels that the United States approach to individuals and human rights and the world and free societies is just flat out wrong, and that their development model is the better one. One of the striking things when you visit most countries around the world is there's 24-hour, very high quality Chinese programming on television, both in English and in whatever the local language is. The United States does not, as a government, invest anything like what the Chinese and the Russians do in propaganda and communications. In fact, President Trump just defunded Radio Free Asia, which for a modest cost was connecting to hundreds of millions of people all over the Indo-Pacific. So what do I see when I see China? A peer competitor that has a fundamentally different idea about how societies ought to be organized. Our economies are very closely intertwined. If you go to Costco or Walmart, if you go to most grocery stores or department stores, an awful lot of what you're buying is made in China or produced in China. And during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union, which also had fundamentally different systems and ideas of government and were in a real competition, the Cold War, our economies were not connected at all. We had very little trade with the Soviet Union. It's fundamentally different today. There's a very large number of Chinese nationals who have been students at American universities for decades now, hundreds of thousands. There's very regular interchange, both trade and scientific and cultural. But the tension, the demonstrable, clear tension between our countries in terms of our competition over market share, mind share, and values has risen steadily in the 15 years that I've been in the Senate.
So President Trump seems to believe that blanket tariffs at a very high percentage is a solution to this. What's your response to that, both on the announcement of the delay of the reciprocal tariffs in general and then the 104% and the continued tariffs on China?
Look, three things. What I've heard from business leaders, small and large, for the 25 years I've been elected and for the near decade that I spent in the private sector with a global manufacturing company, was that predictability, whether in taxes or regulation, whether in the terms of business or in the role of government, predictability is absolutely critical, because being able to predict what the environment is when you're purchasing goods or entering contracts or building new facilities or relocating to new markets, predictability is king. President Trump has demonstrated the most unpredictable economic policy in just a few months of any president in my lifetime, arguably in history. Throwing on double-digit tariffs to our closest partners and allies, Canada and Mexico, our biggest trading partners, and then taking them off and putting them back on, then taking them off, and then slapping huge tariffs on dozens of countries all over the world, and then suspending them abruptly a few days later when the markets begin to tank, but keeping on steadily escalating tariffs against China, I think is a recipe for disaster in terms of our partnerships around the world. I think it's leaving American businesses, large and small, a bit at sea. Imagine you're running a small business and your principal inputs come from a country that, as of yesterday, was facing a 40% tariff rate. Now the president says he's going to suspend it for 90 days. What do? Hurry up and order huge quantities and hoard it before those tariffs come back? Guess that those tariffs will never come back? Explore moving your facilities or your contracts to another source? Get out of the market altogether? Liquidate now while you can? The level of unpredictability that Trump is injecting into our marketplace and our economy is unprecedented and destructive. First. Second, what country would want to enter a free trade agreement or some kind of market arrangement with the United States if the president can, on a whim, put on 10%, take off 10%, put on 50%, take off 50% tariffs? We are today at the highest level of tariffs we've been since the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act that catapulted us into the Great Depression, if you look at U.S.-China. Now, our biggest trading partners are Canada, Mexico, and China, right? And he still has double-digit tariffs on Canada and Mexico. So the coordination between the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the Chinese over how to respond to our tariffs gave me a chill. That two countries that are treaty allies of ours, that we have been close partners with, that are democracies, Japan and Korea, are partnering with the PRC in terms of how to deal with us. That's a very, very bad development.
So we talked a little bit about Trump's approach with China and the concerns therein. I want to switch gears now to Ukraine, which obviously is still a very dire situation, just hasn't been in the news as much because of tariffs and everything else. There's been a lot of conversations about NATO, a lot of conversations about why Americans should care about Ukraine. Unfortunately, there's polling that shows a lot of misinformation out there as well. So could you just give everyone a baseline? Why should people care about Ukraine? What does NATO stand for, and why should we care about that? And as people are talking in their communities about these issues, how do they boil it down in a way that is compelling to Democrats and Republicans alike?
Ukraine is a free country that has a free media, free elections, and was steadily moving towards joining the European Union and NATO. Ukraine was previously a part of the Soviet Union. Russia is not a free country. They do not have free and fair elections. They don't have a free media. And they have one of the largest and most sophisticated militaries on earth. In order to punish Ukraine for imagining they might become part of Europe and they might expand their range of options as a free country. Vladimir Putin first started a war with Ukraine in 2014 when he invaded and occupied Crimea and supported so-called separatists in the eastern part of Ukraine. But in 2022, in February, he launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. His troops have committed war crimes. They have kidnapped and taken back into Russia tens of thousands of innocent children. There are thousands of documented cases of rape and torture of civilians. The Russians have conducted one of the most brutal, aggressive military campaigns in modern history. And they've shattered the peace that has stood the test of time in Europe since the Second World War. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia is the biggest military invasion or war on the European continent since the Second World War, ended in 1945. First. Second, millions of refugees fled Ukraine. They've been overwhelmingly absorbed successfully into Western Europe, not the United States. President Biden led a global effort where 50 countries, all of NATO, plus many EU countries, plus countries on the other side of the world like Japan and Korea, have contributed more to the defense of Ukraine than the United States has. The United States has spent a little over $100 billion in sending weapons and funding to help Ukraine stave off this invasion. And the coalition of countries with the same values that care about not letting powerful countries invade and occupy weaker countries and that care about democracy has been the single largest collective effort to fight for democracy and freedom, I'd argue, since the Second World War. Why does it matter? I don't know. Does it matter that we're a democracy? Does it matter that around the world we've been admired and respected, and a lot of our power and our influence comes from people admiring and respecting our values? I think so. I think the story of the Ukrainians who have served and fought and died bravely at a huge number to enormous sacrifice is one of the most inspiring modern accounts of what it means to stand up for liberty. Last, just a little bit of history, forgive me, but if you walk out the front door of the White House, where President Trump now resides, there's a park. And on the four corners of that park are statues. Statues to military officers who came from Europe and helped the Continental Army defeat the British. Without their training and their support, and this is Lafayette, Rochambeau, von Steuben, and Kosciuszko, without this German, Polish, and French assistance, our revolution never would have succeeded. What we've been doing for Ukraine is that same pay-it-forward assistance. There's no Americans fighting and dying in Ukraine except a handful of volunteers who went and joined the Ukrainian armed forces. But there's no U.S. military fighting presence in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are doing all the fighting. So it's our support that is helping them hold the line against Russian aggression.
So could you give our listeners a little more on NATO, and first of all, what it stands for? And then secondly, what happens if we were to pull out of Ukraine and Putin were allowed to continue his assault? What would the implications be on Europe? And then in general, what would the implications be for the United States?
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which just celebrated 75 years, is the most successful military alliance or treaty organization in history. And its core is Article 5, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. And it's only ever been invoked once, and that was when the United States was attacked on 9/11. And NATO troops served and fought alongside American troops in Afghanistan for 20 years and took casualties and sacrificed at about the same level as the United States on a per capita basis. They showed up early, they fought bravely, they stood alongside us. They could easily have thrown up their hands and said, this is not our fight. Mainland U.S. was not invaded, it was a simple terrorist attack, but they didn't. They came when called and helped defend the United States and our interests. For us to abandon Ukraine would send the message that we are a profoundly unreliable partner and would raise the question whether we're willing to help stop Putin. My friend, the former Senator, late John McCain, said repeatedly, Putin will only stop when we stop him. And in his view, part of what led to this full-scale invasion was that in 2008, he took a bite out of Moldova and he took a bite out of Georgia. In 2014, he took a bite out of Crimea, eastern Ukraine. And his concern was that Putin would just keep going after that. There is, I think, real reason to fear that if the United States abandons Ukraine, Putin will roll over the rest of it and then keep going into the 3 Baltic states, into Poland, into Eastern Europe, whether overtly or covertly, and will end up reconstituting pieces of the Soviet Empire, which has been clearly his goal for years. That then puts the question of whether the United States can be counted on for any of its treaty commitments around the world. And I think that makes us less safe.
So that hasn't been the only area where Trump has been sending certain signals. And these can be talked about again all day, but I think they probably are in a similar bucket because of the kind of sensationalist nature in which he has presented them. But Canada being the 51st state, annexing Greenland and the Panama Canal, 3 very different things, but all seemingly a part of his lexicon these days. So can you just give a reality check on some of these things and your take on them and how we should realistically be pushing back on this?
Here's what alarms me. Russia has brought Iran and North Korea to the fight with Ukraine. The Iranians are manufacturing and delivering huge quantities of drones. The North Koreans have deployed thousands of combat troops, and both of those countries can be reasonably assumed to be getting something back, whether it's military technology, special access to their oil and gas, long-term partnership, and behind all of this, the PRC. Communist China is a key part of facilitating Russia's war on Ukraine. Those 4 countries are increasingly interconnecting. They're doing joint military exercises, they're sharing military technology, and they are a significant threat to us. Great powers can't bluff. I heard that over and over and over after President Obama drew a so-called red line in Syria on the use of chemical weapons and then didn't act when the then dictator of Syria used chemical weapons on his own people. For President Trump to bluff, to joke, to threaten, seriously or not, week after week after week, to retake the Panama Canal, to invade and occupy Greenland, a territory of Denmark, which is a NATO ally of ours, to try and coerce Canada into giving up its sovereignty. I mean, this is bizarre.
What do you think he's
conduct.
doing? What's the...
There's 2 possibilities I've discussed with colleagues. One I find chilling, the other I find confounding. The chilling possibility one colleague suggested was, look, he's just sounding tough. He's posturing as a strongman who's trying to grow American territory so that when he betrays Ukraine and sells out Europe, and people like me who will denounce him for that and say he's putting our security at risk, there will be millions of people who say, well, no, he's a tough guy. He's getting us Greenland. Who cares about Ukraine? I find that hard to process, but it presumes a certain indifference and lack of historical engagement. The other is that he's just someone who bluffs. He just throws stuff around to see what people will do. In some ways, the most alarming or disorienting for a region was when Trump put up on Truth Social an AI-generated video about Gaza after his suggestion that it would make a great resort if bulldozed. Look, I think respect for the United States, admiration for our leadership, confidence in the direction we're heading have long been the baseline of our power in the world. Trump has a fundamentally different view. He thinks being unpredictable, unconventional, testing the limits, the boundaries of what you can say is the way to be influential. It's sort of the madman theory. And you remember from his first term, he spent the first 6 months threatening nuclear war with Kim Jong-un before exchanging love letters with him and sitting down across a table with him. Ultimately, he got nothing for it. He is an unconventional president who does not respect any of the rules of diplomacy or defense or development, any of the traditions. And so what I think is at risk is while he is distracting or entertaining or alarming his followers on social media and the world audience, he's a social media performer. He's a reality TV star. He's producing another episode in his head of, Trump the Apprentice. And in fact, what he's doing is destroying the confidence that the world has in our ability to lead.
And there's a lot of conversation about strategic value of some of these countries and therein. You touched on Canada. I want to make sure that listeners understand what the strategic value and how we should be working with Greenland and the Panama Canal. And then also I neglected to bring up Taiwan as part of China as well. And I know, again, we only have a few minutes here, but I want to make sure that these key things that listeners understand are able to talk to others about.
So I met with the foreign minister of Denmark and a Greenlandic representative at a recent global security conference and said, let me just make sure I understand something. Before all these threats to take Greenland by force, if a representative of the new Trump administration had come to Greenland, Denmark, and said, we'd like to expand our military footprint because the Arctic's important and we want to be able to monitor and observe Chinese and Russian submarine and naval activity. Oh, absolutely, of course, we'd welcome it, that'd be great. We actually have an existing treaty that allows the United States to expand its military footprint anytime you want. And okay. Imagine if the new Trump administration had come to you and said, we're concerned about critical minerals and our dependence on China. As the ice sheet melts, could we work with you to explore and identify and perhaps jointly develop your mineral resource? Oh, absolutely. We would have welcomed it with open arms. I said, fine. Here we are several months later, after repeated threats to take Greenland by force. What's your response now? We don't want any part of the Trump administration trying to tell us what to do and who to be in our role. These are unforced errors. We easily could have sent Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, to Panama to have conversations with the leadership of Panama about the management of the canal and the role of the Chinese and the role of the United States.
And can you explain what the Panama Canal, what the value of Panama Canal to the United States?
The Panama Canal is the principal means by which shipping goes between the Pacific and the Atlantic. It was constructed by the United States. It was American territory for a long time, the Panama Canal Zone, but returned to the Panamanian people in a treaty signed under President Carter. But there is no demonstrable proof that control of the Panama Canal has been handed to the Chinese. As is the case with Greenland, the Panamanians I've met with and talked to about this issue have also said, no, we welcome American involvement. If you want to invest more with us in upgrading and modernizing the canal, we'd appreciate it. So he's picking fights with countries and partners like Canada, where, look, the Canadians are the nicest people on the planet. They're some of the kindest, most generous people I've ever known. We have the world's longest unguarded border with them. And so Trump tried to justify slapping huge tariffs on Canada, claiming there was a fentanyl crisis. A tiny percent of the fentanyl that is coming into our country and is killing Americans is coming from Canada. It's overwhelmingly coming from China and Mexico. And so Canadians were mostly either puzzled and then offended. It's pretty striking that in a championship hockey match, Canadian audiences were booing the American national anthem. Look, I'm from the Philadelphia area. We boo our own sports teams regularly.
And Santa Claus.
I mean, throw snowballs at Santa Claus. But for Canadians to boo the American national anthem is a profound sign of the depths of their anger and disrespect and concern. And there's a lot of work, there's a lot of repair work to be done if we still have good relations with countries like Panama and Denmark and Greenland and Canada. Taiwan, if I could briefly, Look, Congress has long played an active role in U.S. relations with Taiwan. Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, has made it clear that it's his goal to reunite the mainland and Taiwan in one country. And our one China policy has long taken a position of strategic ambiguity about whether we would or wouldn't militarily defend Taiwan against a PRC effort to coerce, to militarily try to retake Taiwan. And it's been our hope, I think, as a country for decades, that this would remain peaceful and that at some point it would be resolved peaceably, the status of Taiwan.
And can you also just outline how Taiwan feels about this situation?
So I've only been to Taiwan several times, but I've been several times. And the Taiwan government feels fairly strongly that as a democracy, that they should have the central voice in the self-determination of the people of Taiwan and its future status. They long enjoyed very good and close economic relations and, of course, deep cultural and historic ties with mainland China. But under Xi Jinping's leadership, the CCP has become far more aggressive. And in the last decade, the number of naval and air incursions into Taiwan's economic zone have increased dramatically. The number of flights and naval incursions into their area of control has been significantly increased. And they've moved from training exercises to rehearsals for either invasion and amphibious landings or quarantine. So the tension, the level of tension, I think, in Taiwan has steadily increased. I landed in Taipei during the pandemic with Senators Duckworth and Sullivan in a C-17 full of vaccines. Taiwan had managed to avoid any significant harm during the pandemic, but there'd been an air crew that had brought COVID to Taiwan, and they were having a sudden outbreak that was accelerating very rapidly, and they turned to the United States for help. And I thought it was critical that we deliver our highly effective vaccines rather than the competing potential, either Sputnik from Russia or the Chinese vaccine. And I thought that was an important visit. I've also taken longer visits, both before that trip and afterwards. Look, I think the people of Taiwan are a particular threat or concern to the CCP because they show an island that is culturally and historically Chinese, that has a robust free media, that has a robust democracy, and has one of the world's most high technology, high performing, highly profitable industries, semiconductor chips. TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, has a massive facility, and most major semiconductor companies on Earth have facilities on Taiwan. And they make both the sort of base level chips that go into everything from cars to refrigerators and the most sophisticated cutting edge chips. Were Taiwan to be militarily reabsorbed into the PRC, this would set a terrible precedent, both for the use of force to resolve territorial disputes. It would significantly change access to the most cutting-edge technology that's critical for everything from artificial intelligence to precision biology to the phones and computers we all use. And it would have huge consequences regionally as China has continued to expand its presence into the South China Sea. Having active control over Taiwan would significantly implicate the region.
The last issue I wanted to cover, last area I wanted to cover, is Europe, and we touched on it, but Munich Security Conference happened a couple months ago. Vice President Vance spoke. You were there. I just want to hear from your perspective how you're feeling. First of all, if you could tell listeners what some of the concerns were, but then also how you were feeling as someone who is internationally recognized as, a leader on foreign affairs, what you were hearing from people there and your immediate reaction and how people should be thinking about it.
Look, I've been at the Munich Security Conference when Vice President Biden spoke, when Vice President Pence spoke. when Vice President Harris spoke and when Vice President Vance spoke. I've never seen a reaction in that room from leaders from Europe and around the world comparable to the reaction to Vice President Vance.
And I should ask you to explain what the Munich Security Conference is for listeners.
Oh, so it's an annual conference in Munich about security where defense ministers and senior generals and admirals and foreign ministers and business leaders and think tankers and commentators from 50 countries around the world gather. And it is often a place to which a very large bipartisan and bicameral delegation from Congress goes as well. There's often dozens and dozens of senators and House members. And it's a weekend, and the reason there's value in it is in one place at one time in one weekend, a group of us from the Senate can sit down with heads of state from 10 countries and defense ministers, foreign ministers from 10 other countries, and have a chance to hear from our new NATO allies, Finland and Sweden, to hear from Zelensky about the war in Ukraine, to hear from the four-star general in charge of all U.S. forces in Europe about his assessment, to meet with leaders from Germany to Great Britain to Italy to Japan to South Korea. So it's really an efficient way to engage with a lot of people from a lot of countries, as well as people from our own country. Quite a few of our ambassadors and military leaders from Europe attend as well. Look, there was a stunned silence when Vice President Vance concluded, both because of what he said and where he was saying it and how he was saying it. Munich was, of course, famously the site of the betrayal of the people of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, the so-called Peace in Our Time conference, where Hitler was appeased by the UK and encouraged to continue to accelerate his aggression, which ultimately led to the Second World War. And Vance, who I knew as a senator, has more than just about any other senator when he was serving in the Senate, been of the view that Ukraine is not a vital national security interest of the United States and that we need to shift our focus to Asia and to containing China. And his tone was scolding the leaders of Europe, and part of it was what he said and what he did afterwards. So he commented on the recent elections in Romania and the invalidation of those elections by the Romanian Constitutional Court in a way that seemed to favor a very marginal pro-Putin candidate, and made some remarks about what's in the national security interest of the United States and what's not. And what I think a lot of attendees were most struck by was that he chose to go out to dinner with the leader of the Alternative for Deutschland, or the AfD, which is a far-right party in Germany when elections were just a few weeks after that conference. And that was taken as inappropriate interference in domestic politics in Germany.
So we've talked a lot about some of the threats. We've covered a lot of ground on where we think we should be going. I guess my last question to you is about painting an alternative vision and how people should be thinking about what we should be doing otherwise. When people are talking in their communities with people who are disaffected, we hear all the time, I'm sure you hear all the time, I'm done with politics, can't even keep up anymore, I don't even know what's real anymore, my neighbor who voted for President Biden, voted for President Trump, et cetera. So what is the positive alternate vision that we should arm our listeners with, that they can go out into their communities and talk to people about? And what do you think we should be doing in terms of our status on the world stage? Because you've alluded to it in many of these cases, but I think people are really hungering for the message that the tight couple-line message that they can bring out to their communities.
We are in the middle of a fight over who we are. Who is America? Who are Americans? How will we be seen in the world? How will we act in the world? When President Biden was elected in 2020, he went and visited with a European head of state and said, America is back. And this national leader looked at him and said, yes, but for how long? And that speaks to the sharp concern that our closest allies and most trusted partners have. When USAID was illegally shut down abruptly, despite there being a law that says only Congress can agree to do that. And when thousands and thousands of staff were laid off around the world for our nonprofit partners in AID, that sent a clear signal to a lot of the world that we're not a country of compassion, that we're not a reliable partner when it comes to everything from fighting trafficking and disease to promoting security and combating disinformation. There are ways that we can continue to do that good work, personally, privately, philanthropically, whether through your faith community or through a nonprofit you admire or through the work of great organizations that are still doing this. I think that is worth investing time and heart and energy in. In our own neighborhoods and communities, there's just an increasing coarseness and anger about politics. As you said, there's folks who are saying, oh, my friend, my neighbor, my relative voted for so-and-so, voted for so-and-so. I'd encourage, which seems an odd thing to do, your listeners to make sure that they're putting down the phone and turning off the TV a little bit. Less time on MSNBC, less time on Twitter or X, and take that time and invest it in family, in community, in building real human connection, in being less enraged and more engaged. And recognize that, in my view, President Trump has wildly overreached. His chaotic and unpredictable tariff decisions of the last few weeks threw our markets into chaos and likely will continue to. The idea that huge tariffs can restore America's manufacturing greatness is one of the few things he's consistently believed for decades. He's held almost every other view, but this is something that he was speaking out about in the 80s. And speaking up in a measured, thoughtful, well-informed way in your family, in your neighborhood, at your business, in your community, in the ways where you engage, and demanding respect and giving respect is important to showing that we are a civil society that can disagree in an agreeable way. And then last, if you've got the heart for it, get engaged, because change really is going to come from the ground up. We're going to see special elections for state rep and state senate and city council and county council seats. There are elections in New Jersey and Virginia this year that are critical. There was just a big election for the Wisconsin Supreme Court seat that will control the majority of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And we are not that far from midterm elections where control of the House and the Senate will be on the line. In 2017, 4 women chose to step forward and run for Congress. First-time candidates, amazing, capable, talented, passionate candidates who are now my colleagues in Congress and who won seats that had been represented by Republicans for decades and decades. They were folks who were sitting at home watching what was going on in 2017 saying, I disagree with this. This isn't the America that I believe in. And so they took a bold step and stepped forward, stood up, and ran. Not everybody who runs will win. Not everybody who volunteers and contributes and engages will be satisfied by it. But you have to ask yourself, at this moment, where the very definition of American is at risk and is at issue, do you have something to say? Do you believe we're better than this? Do you think we're a different country than the one you're watching unfold on television and social media every night? I sure do. And I need help. We need people engaging, rolling up their sleeves, and fighting for who we've been, who we are, and who we are called to be.
Senator Chris Coons, thank you for coming on the People's Cabinet.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the People's Cabinet. If you did, please like, subscribe, ring that bell, and put in the comments below who else you'd like to see sworn in. And stay tuned for new episodes every Tuesday. Let's go.